Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. Please consider becoming a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can listen to Labyrinths ad-free.
Visit patreon.com/Knox Robinson to learn more.
Beginning my career as a young physician, I was stepping into a rural clinic where my predecessor, we shared the same last name. So we were two doctors, Gilmer. When I started inheriting his patients, I started to learn about a man who was a beloved doctor, a man who took care of his community, and a man who I learned had committed a horrific crime.
Feeling lost?
Then you're in the right place.
I'm Amanda Knox.
And I'm Christopher Robinson.
And this is Labyrinths.
That was the voice of Dr. Benjamin Gilmer. Just out of his medical residency, he joined a rural North Carolina clinic, only to find that its previous doctor shared his last name. Dr. Vince Gilmer was loved and respected by his patients and by his community, right up until he strangled his ailing father, sawed his fingers off, and then returned to the clinic for a regular week of work. Vince Gilmer's arrest for murder shocked his patients. He had always been so kind and empathetic with them. How could he be capable of such violence? Dr. Benjamin Gilmer looked deeper and deeper into Vince Gilmer's case, and he became obsessed with discovering what had pushed a seemingly good man to commit murder. What he discovered would shake his understanding of moral responsibility, free will, and how our justice system responds to mental illness.
And so I had started forming theories about what could have happened to his brain, why his mind went awry. And that led down a decade-long pursuit to figure out what happened to him and to put a label on the pathos that had occurred to him. And that led me to discover many things about myself, but also really about the system, the carceral system, which I really had no concept of before. And then I started discovering things more deeply, like mental illness and how the mind can be so fallible and why we have to consider social justice and empathy in a different perspective. And that, for me, it was a heavy burden because I was starting to realize that I was part of this story, whether I liked it or not. And the physicians are also culpable in this journey because we are the people that help to identify mental illness and create access for those patients. And so for me, it was a story that was shocking to be intertwined with this person and the system that I didn't know before. And then it led me down a long rabbit hole of self-discovery and trying to figure out where our minds rest amongst our neurons and where our sense of self is and whether there's free will and where the threshold of culpability lies.
I'm curious to know what it was like when you were interviewing for that position. I'm imagining this, HR person is holding your resume in front of her and she's going, Dr. Gilmer, huh? Like how did you discover that you had this sort of awkward legacy that came before you when you landed in this new clinic as a young doctor?
Well, really, it was the interview. Like I didn't know much about it. And so they were perplexed. They were like, why? Really? Do we really want to take him? And so the administration was concerned. And they thought it was a bad idea to have another Dr. Gilmer follow the murderous Dr. Gilmer and that might not be the best therapeutic option for the community. And so they were questioning me. And I just wanted a job at the time and hadn't dug in deep to figure out what happened to this man or even the murder that he committed. I didn't know anything about that. So it was the stories, actually, that I learned from his patients that were the ones that painted the picture of who this other Dr. Gilmer was.
That's interesting. So at first, you were just like, gosh darn it, like, gosh, my luck that I'm trying to get a job. And the last person who was here who had my name was a murderer. How inconvenient. And it wasn't until your patients talked to you about him that your curiosity about him grew. Is that fair to say?
I was just trying to learn how to be a new doctor, but his patients were so committed to believing that he was innocent. They couldn't reconcile in their minds why or how even he could have done this. And so they were just bewildered by the whole thing and had never really had someone to ask these questions and to share their concern or frustration, like trying to figure out what had happened to their beloved doctor. And it was so believable that I wanted to believe it too. And they were so committed to the goodness of this man that they were the people who like inspired this journey. It was through their deeply personal stories about this man and that he couldn't be purely guilty, or at least they wanted me to know that he was so much more than that one terrible event.
And when they posed that idea to you that he's more than this horrible thing that he's done, did you automatically, as a sort of guy with this background in pathology, think that there was some kind of mental illness that played a role? Or were you thinking, well, he was maybe a good doctor, but clearly not a good son, and people are complicated? Like, when did you start thinking that mental illness had some part of it?
I think it was really after discovering that he fired his lawyer for his trial. And that's just not a rational thing to do. It's not a normal thing to do. And then I started learning little nuanced stories about his past. And like he had a traumatic brain injury from an accident 6 months before. And that he himself was describing that he had come off his antidepressant very precipitously. And that he also had traumatic stress PTSD from a long history of sexual abuse by his father. And so, it was easy to see how one element might have contributed to his symptoms. But then I started seeing a much fuller picture. The picture of mental illness doesn't come from one single event. It usually comes from 1,000 cuts or several large cuts. And it was becoming evident to me that this man had experienced a lot of trauma in his life, and that some people were noticing some weird behaviors with him. One of my biases is that I see the world like through the lens of the brain. My master's thesis was like traumatic brain injury in part. So then it was easy to jump to that conclusion that, he must have had a traumatic brain injury because good people don't do bad things without a reason. And so that was a pivotal moment where I started seeing this person and his brain as being one who's experiencing pathos. Something had led him in that direction.
And you weren't just, armchair diagnosing, right? Like you went and met this man in person.
Yeah, I went to the prison along with Sarah Koenig, who's an NPR reporter. And what we saw was a man who was in distress, a man who had been hospitalized for nearly a decade, who walked very awkwardly and who had lots of shakes and dyskinesias in his face. And it was clear at that point that he had a problem, either deeply psychiatric or deeply neurologic. And it was easy to see it. It was easy to diagnose that. But the bias of my brain was still like not wanting to buy the whole story. It was still like wanting to shift back to this notion that I've been hearing all these years, that he was a quote unquote cold-blooded murderer, which is how the judge described him.
Dr. Gilmer eventually came to believe that Vince Gilmer was afflicted with Huntington's disease, and that the effects of the disease were aggravated by a series of complicating factors, from his recent brain injury from a car accident to sexual abuse from his schizophrenic father. This diagnosis was eventually confirmed by medical tests.
I'm curious to know how you interpreted how the court reacted to this man, the other Gilmore, and his crimes, because you say that he was presented to be this cold-blooded killer, this, quote, malingerer. What evidence was the prosecution presenting to support that idea?
In their minds, it was a slam dunk case. He tried to conceal the murder. He tried to evade the law. And they had attached all these biases that he was highly intelligent because he was a doctor, and that he was manipulative to the core, and that there was a reason. They thought he had a motive, that he didn't want to pay his father's bills anymore, and that his father had not been a good father. And so they came at it from a very discrete perspective. And in their minds, he was guilty of all those things. But they never looked any further. And this is what was disturbing, because this was the first trial I'd ever explored before. I'd never been a part of any legal process before. I had no idea what a clemency Hail Mary would look like. I had no idea what habeas corpus looked like. I didn't even know the difference really between a prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney. I mean, I sort of knew that, but I was very naive to the whole thing. But what I was not naive about was they were not asking the right questions. And that after reading the 800-page trial, it was clear that each person had their very discrete job. The prosecutor wanted to prosecute as quickly as possible. The judge wanted to rule as quickly as possible. There were not expert witnesses that represented Vince Gilmer. There was not a defense lawyer because he released them. And there was no chance of him surviving this trial. Like it was very easy for them to convict him. So from my perspective, I was looking at this case through the only lens that I know, which is a human lens, but also a clinical lens. And from that perspective, they were asking none of the right questions. Like they didn't ask if there was a family history of mental illness. They didn't ask what his father's diagnosis was, why he was in a mental health facility. He had been diagnosed as having schizophrenia. They didn't explore that traumatic brain injury that he had had. They completely denied that there was any relationship with SSRI discontinuation syndrome. That's when you stop an antidepressant, a specific antidepressant. 20% of those patients have very significant symptoms. As most lawyers who have reviewed that trial would describe, it was an abomination of the justice system, that it was a constitutional trial, but that it was not a fair trial, and that any average lawyer would have asked the appropriate questions that would have directed him to a hospital instead of to a prison. That's what I thought would have been the most appropriate aspect for him, was to go to a hospital. I started seeing him as a victim.
Why do you think that his mental illness was overlooked in this case? And do you think that that is a systemic problem, or is this a rare case of the mental illness being overlooked or sort of swept to the side?
Well, I mean, he didn't have a defense attorney to direct the jury in that direction. But it's interesting because not guilty by reason of insanity is used in less than 1% of cases like this. And of those cases, only 0.25% are successful in using the NGRI defense. It's interesting and also very sad to me that oftentimes when mental illness is brought up in a case similar to this, that it can be worse. There's a greater chance that a sentence could be longer if mental illness is brought into the picture.
Right.
But in Vince's case in particular, they didn't believe he had a mental illness. The one forensic psychologist that examined him diagnosed him as a malingerer, that he was faking these symptoms. And so once that was brought into the picture, that tainted every belief system that every person during the trial had about him. That led more credence to this idea that he was a cunning, cold-blooded murderer. So it was an idea that was planted early on in the trial and was never overcome.
You said that because he had fired his attorney, there wasn't really someone to make the case for mental illness, but that suggests that it's of no interest to the prosecution. Do you find, now that you've sort of come into a lot of advocacy, that there tends to be resistance on the part of prosecutors to ever even consider mental illness as a contributing factor?
Well, it's interesting because the belief system that we are fully in control, that is what our entire legal system is predicated on, that we have agency all the time. And even if you have mental illness, the idea of competency is something that comes up a lot in these trials. You can be fully mentally ill and be fully competent at the same time. Like the bar is very, very low to meet competency. You could be diagnosed with schizophrenia and still have the awareness of what it means to ask appropriate questions and respond in a trial. What's more important initially is competency. Now, I went to a conference with some of the top 1% of trial lawyers in the country, and there were many judges who were there. They love these kind of philosophical, questions about competency and where mental illness fits in terms of where one lies on the culpability spectrum. And in many of their minds, I learned that you can be fully mentally ill and still fully competent and fully culpable of whatever action you perceive. It's ambiguous. If you are on the spectrum of mental illness, then that can mean many, many things. Like that could mean mild generalized anxiety. That could mean full major depression with psychosis. That can mean schizophrenia or bipolar. Our spectrum of consciousness and our spectrum of awareness about our agency changes all the time. And we do not have our full agency in every moment. And that was the case with the other Dr. Gilmer, with Vince. In that moment that he killed his father, he was hearing voices telling him to do so. He did not have full agency of what his mind, his brain was telling him to do in that moment. But if you ask most prosecutors, they believe that this question of free will or agency is part of the human experience. Do we always have that agency or free will, even in the presence of mental illness?
Certainly makes their job harder. Like, if suddenly the question of free will comes into play. We could give you lots of reasons to support Labyrinths on Patreon, including ad-free episodes and exclusive patron-only content. But why not hear it direct from a listener?
My name is Henry, and I've been a supporter of the Labyrinths podcast for some time. I can totally relate to the concept of feeling lost, and I think the stories have helped me tremendously getting through these last couple of years, and I think they would help others as well.
Visit patreon.com/Knox Robinson. In thinking about the case of Dr. Vince Gilmer, it's worth digging a little deeper into the question of free will. For most of us, including most judges, prosecutors, and jury members, the fact that we have free will is an assumption we take for granted. Of course we do, right? There are countless books and philosophical essays on the subject, the most recent prominent book being Robert Sapolsky's Determined. And we don't have time here to offer a thorough argument against free will, but we will ask you to indulge us a moment and consider the case of Charles Whitman, the Texas Tower sniper, who in 1966 stabbed his wife and mother, then shot 3 people on the University of Texas at Austin campus, then climbed the clock tower there and fired at random people for 96 minutes, killing 11 more and wounding 31 others. He was eventually shot dead by law enforcement. We might never know what compelled Whitman's actions, if not for the note he left. He wrote, "I do not really understand myself these days. I'm supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I cannot recall when it started, I've been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts." He dearly loved his wife and mother, he said, but was overwhelmed by violent impulses. This would all be a curiosity, if not for the fact that he also mentioned suffering from tremendous headaches, and requested that after his death, an autopsy would be performed on me to see if there is any visible physical disorder. Well, an autopsy was performed, and lo and behold, a pecan-sized brain tumor was found in his hypothalamus, pressing on his amygdala, the region of the brain that helps regulate emotions such as fear, anxiety, and aggression. While a commission of neurosurgeons and psychologists formed by the governor failed to find a clear link between the tumor and Whitman's actions, with their 1966 knowledge of neurophysiology and psychology, it remains plausible that the tumor was a primary cause. Now, ask yourself, on learning of Whitman's tumor, do you alter your judgment towards him, at least partially mitigating his moral responsibility for his actions? Sam Harris brings up this case as a springboard into a broader understanding of how our lack of free will relates to moral responsibility. In his series of lectures on free will in the Waking Up app, he says the following:
that a brain tumor is just a special case of our having insight into the fact that physical events give rise to thoughts and actions. If we fully understood the neurophysiology of any murderer's brain, it would seem just as exculpatory as finding a tumor in it. If we could see how the wrong genes were being relentlessly transcribed, and how this person's experiences in life has sculpted the microstructure of his brain in just such a way to produce states of mind which were guaranteed to make him violent. If we could see this causality clearly, the basis for placing blame on him, in any deep sense, would disappear.
Now, you don't have to examine the full moral implications of truly taking a lack of free will seriously to acknowledge that not one of us chooses our genes, our parents, our childhood and adolescent environments. Even if you insist on there being some role for free will to play, we are still greatly influenced by all these other factors that we have no control over. One response to this quandary is to rethink our criminal justice system in terms of public health. In that sense, we can see violent criminals as victims of their own neurophysiology, as people afflicted with a contagious disease that can spread harm to others if left unchecked. If we want to protect society, we must quarantine such people until they are no longer ill. And if we are compassionate to those afflicted with the disease of violent impulses, we should take all available measures to cure them. Needless to say, our current justice system in the U.S. does very little to rehabilitate citizens who are a danger to others. Instead, it is designed mostly to punish, and that impulse starts to look very questionable in cases like that of Dr. Vince Gilmer, who by all accounts was kind, compassionate, and caring, until he began hearing voices.
It kind of poses this almost unanswerable question of what are we even doing with our criminal justice system? What does justice mean if we can't hold people accountable the way that we think we can? And how does fairness come into play? Like, all of these questions are rendered so complicated, but I think that the resistance to exploring them also comes at great cost, because we're learning more and more about the human psyche every day, and we're still relying upon old systems that are predicated on some very dogmatic ideas about what is actually happening inside the human psyche. I wonder if you can talk to me a little bit about how the implications of this specific trial, this specific case, sort of led you to take a broader look at our medical institutions and our criminal justice institutions and how they intersect.
For me, it was sort of a naive discovery of what our current system is. When you start digging into the statistics, you realize that 40 to 60% of all incarcerated people have severe mental illness, not just run-of-the-mill anxiety. They have severe mental illness. There's a 10x greater population of people with severe mental illness living in our prison system than in all of our mental hospitals throughout the whole country. I mean, that's like a staggering number. And it was so hard for me to learn that and then to accept it as, someone who's taken the Hippocratic Oath. And so that I started to explore at that point, why is this happening? And then firstly, to reframe what happened to Vince Gilmer through a clinical lens. And when you do that, you see this is really an abomination of the system. Why would we do that? Why would we put somebody in prison who didn't have full agency during that moment, who didn't have any concept of what a consequence would be? He wasn't thinking about serving life in prison when he was fully delusional and hearing voices.
Aside from his history of anxiety and his history of sexual abuse and his recent head trauma, a few days before Dr. Vince Gilmer murdered his father, he abruptly stopped taking his antidepressant, Lexapro. That's when he began to hear voices. In a letter he wrote to his doctor from jail, he said, "These are not voices that make a suggestion. This is a compulsion. The compulsion is trying to take over my consciousness. I fight the compulsion in the front part of my head. It is a hyper-anxious state. Pacing becomes mandatory, trying to walk off the pressure. The battle hurts badly."
It was something he couldn't even imagine in that moment. When you look at the intersection of medicine, our mass incarceration, you start to see such a breakdown. You start to realize that we're not doing our part. because we should all be speaking up against these statistics. Like, this is such moral hazard. We should all be inflamed by what we're seeing in the prison system. Because what it means is that we're not concerned at all about rehabilitation. It means that we're concerned exclusively about punishment. And I know you've experienced that, like, very personally. And maybe in Italy, it's a little bit different, but in the States, there is very little attempt to rehabilitate because it's so hard for us to get beyond the premise that the mind can change and can be healed. So one of the chapters in my book, The Other Dutch Gilmer, is called Healing Crime, because rehabilitation is a clinical scenario. It's a clinical process, and it's not done well in prison. And I just feel like this is the intersection of our two worlds. That's where change happens. And that's where visioning happens. That's where we can start to reimagine like a different paradigm. There's so many people that are saying these things, but it's really hard, I feel like, to align all the voices. And medicine, in my view, has really been sidelined. We've not brought strong voices to this argument.
Why do you think that is?
60% of doctors in America are experiencing burnout. That's part of the problem. In this for-profit world of medicine, advocacy is not the number one priority. Making money is a big component of the medical industry, the enterprise of medicine. And most family physicians, they don't have time built into their schedules for advocacy. Most rural doctors are trying to survive the day and be present at home with their families when they can. And so it's a challenge, I think, for physicians or nurse practitioners to actually have the time to do the deep dive inquiry into something that really moves them. And for me, like, this whole story has been a deep dive inquiry into what happened to this man. And then I became really transformed by the horrifying elements that I learned about mass incarceration, and that we lock up more mentally ill people than we put in hospitals. What Vince has taught me, and probably what you've learned too, like through your podcasts and all the advocacy that you've done regarding the criminal justice system, is that you've learned that you have a voice, and voices can resonate and go far if you find outlets for them. And that was the whole intention of my book, was to give it to the governor of Virginia, to help him understand like what happened with this man, because most clemency decisions are based on politics. So after giving the governor a book and distributing it in his cabinet, someone read it and they changed their mind. They reversed the clemency rejection, which had happened 6 months before the governor's tenure. So on the governor's last day in office, he granted Vince Gilmer clemency.
Wow.
And said that he was free to go to a suitable hospital or medical setting. Keyword suitable. I thought at that point that we had succeeded, that we had won this battle, and that he would go free and he would finally start his healing journey. And that didn't happen because it took a year to find a hospital that would take him. And after countless rejections, I learned that our system is so inadequate for treating complex patients with mental illness. He was a complex patient that had been convicted of murder, and so nobody would take him. And until one hospital finally did, and then they, after 5 months of negotiating, they decided they wouldn't take him. And that was my hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, Mission Hospital, an HCA hospital. They ultimately decided that the PR risk was too great for them. And so they said no. We did actually find another hospital, and they're waiting to take him right now, but the Virginia Parole Board added new language to his parole conditions that he needs to be in a locked hospital. And hospitals aren't locked in our country.
Right. I mean, I was about to say, one of the interesting challenges potentially is there was a shift historically in the United States away from institutionalizing people against their will, this idea of a locked hospital. And the result of that was that a lot more of these mentally ill people ended up getting shunted into prison instead. And we're still facing that problem. Do you think that we need to revisit this issue of when and how the state can impose some kind of custody over people who pose a potential threat because of mental illness? Because like I'm trying to do the devil's advocate sort of argument here of like, okay, I'm imagining I'm a prosecutor and I'm going, well, what else am I going to do? Is this Minority Report? Do I wait until somebody commits a crime and then somebody's dead? How do we deal with the problems of prevention and deterrence? All of those factors come into play. So how do you think prosecutors should think about mental illness when it comes to prosecuting cases? And do you think that prosecutors should take their own kind of version of the Hippocratic Oath?
Yes, I do. They should take their own Hippocratic Oath. I mean, this is like the age-old philosophical question, like, how do we protect a community and how do we protect people from themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Where does culpability lie within that spectrum? I guarantee if every prosecutor took the Hippocratic Oath, they would see things a little bit differently. And those people with mental illness, they're not criminals, because if you have mental illness, it doesn't mean you're going to gravitate towards criminality. Like that's not the case at all. But humans are very fallible. If prosecutors, judges, lawyers, doctors, if we could all recognize to some degree together that our brains do make mistakes all the time and that our left hemisphere does lie to us often, probably daily. If we began to see the brain as something that's not fully in its seat of agency all the time, that there is a spectrum and that humans do bad things, not because they're inherently bad, but because a brain that's exposed to trauma, a child that's been exposed to abuse, like a child that's had an ACE score of 10, which is like how to risk stratify the amount of trauma a child has had in their life. Like that score predicts the likelihood of going to prison one day, or the likelihood that they may even have medical or mental illness one day. If you can begin to see that and accept how the brain is formed, how it is so often fallible, then you can realize, a brain like that can be rehabilitated. Like we don't give up on our patients who come in who have severe mental illness. We know we can make their lives better. We know we can help them. But that's not the perspective of a court or a jury. The jury is trying to keep the community safe. But I think the biggest problem is that we don't really believe as a culture, as a society, that rehabilitation for someone who's committed a crime such as murder, we don't really believe that it's possible to rehabilitate those folks. If our judges believed in the Hippocratic Oath, if our judges believed that people could truly be rehabilitated, and I'm not saying that all judges don't believe that, or that all prosecuting attorneys don't believe that. More and more, they do believe that, I think. I've had the great opportunity to meet several people recently. I was speaking to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Georgia, and this man is really believes that. And he is trying to divert people who experience mental illness and crime towards appropriate places where they can get treatment first. Because these people are, whether you're a sheriff or a judge, they are tired of seeing their jails and prisons full of folks who are experiencing mental illness. They don't feel good about that either.
I mean, all of this super resonates with me. I've, lived alongside women in prison for years of my life, and I was astonished, just utterly astonished at the deep, deep psychological scars in the women around me, whether it was from schizophrenia, the obvious sort of signs of mental illness, like they're talking to themselves, they're covered in their own feces, whatever. I had one cellmate who just constantly scratched herself, so she had open sores all over her body. But everywhere from that end of the spectrum to just people who were suffering from PTSD from having lived in poverty their entire life, having been neglected or abused in some way. So many of the women that I met were victims of crime before they ever were criminals themselves. So the idea that anyone in that prison was okay was kind of astonishing to me. And I can tell you, I very much had guards come up to me and say things like, "Oh, Amanda, you're just the ideal prisoner because you're not like all the rest of these lunatics." And I was like, "Well, I'm not supposed to be here." And also, like, what are we doing? So, like, prison is for perfectly healthy people who follow the rules and do everything they're told, because we need to punish them. And then the rest of these lunatics are just here because we don't have anywhere better to put them. And so obviously I saw firsthand all of these contradictions within the system. But because I saw it firsthand, I did not realize until I lived it myself that this was the scenario, that this is what it actually looked like. This is what mental illness in the criminal justice system ultimately resulted in. Ta-da, here's the product. Instead, I grew up and I was raised with this notion that there's good behavior and bad behavior. There are good people and bad people. And when you do something bad happens to you. You go to prison. To this day, my biggest issue that I come up with when I'm talking about these kinds of issues as an advocate, trying to change the system for the better, make it more rehabilitative versus punitive, is this like fixed notion that people have that there are good people and bad people. Or even if bad people can be rehabilitated, do they deserve to be? Because they did something bad.
Mm-hmm.
Something bad needs to happen in order for the badness of their action to be balanced out in the universe or acknowledged societally. Like, how do you encounter those problems in your work, and how do you respond to them?
Simple question. Oh my gosh. In my mind, I'm really trying to push this idea that the human brain is inherently fallible and that the people we put in prison are the most vulnerable. And I think the hard part for many of us humans is that we don't want to acknowledge that fact. We don't want to acknowledge that we could be like those people, those women that you saw in the prison, that we could become that person experiencing schizophrenia or bipolar. Like, there's such an aversion, like our minds do not want to even perceive that that's a possibility. It's much easier to just punish those people because it puts them away. It gets them out of our field of view, because that's what we do best from a historical context is the punishment part. So trying to elevate this concept that empathy does come from seeing the vulnerability of other humans. Like, that was sort of the concept that I continue to believe and advocate for. And it was sort of the culmination of my book was this idea of reverence for life, which is a philosophy from Albert Schweitzer, who was a Renaissance man and physician and philosopher in the 1960s. This concept that he birthed was a very simple one that I think really enables everyone to experience the Hippocratic Oath, and that, we have to see people who are suffering and recognize that we have a duty to help those most vulnerable. And his mantra for life was to instill that philosophy so that others could also start to see that. It's easier for our brains to see that vulnerability and then to recognize them as bad. It takes a lot more effort to see that vulnerability and recognize, that this is a very complex organ with very complex structures and physiology, and that it's a brain that's under attack, one that can be salvaged. Until I think you adopt that philosophy of reverence, or until you recognize that it's not just that person's brain that can be fallible, it's your brain. It's like all of our brains. When you see that and you can climb into a different space that allows you to recognize that those people they're not just perpetrators. They may be perpetrators, but they're also victims. And then you start to see a healing path.
I think that one of the reasons why many people have this knee-jerk reaction to do things the way we've always done them, which is that punitive model, is because they find it very, very hard to imagine what an alternative would look like and how it might satisfy the harm, the like irrevocable, unhealable harm that some crimes cause. Can you speak to that at all?
Prisons are so invisible to most people, firstly. you don't spend years in a prison, you never know what's happening in a prison. And so there's that sort of barrier. The prisons are hidden and we don't know what's happening there. This makes me think that we don't have a healthcare model in our country that even healthy people recognize as being a successful one. So I think given the fact that our whole medical system is very dysfunctional, it's hard to imagine how a healthcare system within a carceral system, how that could even work. We don't have that model. I mean, there have been examples over the years historically where, back in the late 60s in Dannemora Prison in New York, they were trying to implement systems that recognized how patients could be rehabilitated differently. We've been at this for a long time, but few models have been that successful because we haven't landed, just like we didn't land back in the 70s and 80s, trying to get people out of mental hospitals into community hospitals or community mental health centers. We didn't land that very well. Those people went straight to the street because those systems were not funded appropriately. It's really hard for people to believe that we could actually achieve that in our carceral system, in our prisons, in our jails.
Do you think we can achieve it, or are we screwed?
Well, we can't provide appropriate education for kindergarteners, and we can't provide access to care for all Americans. So from that perspective, we're doing a really terrible job. But if we can't fix our healthcare system, it's going to be really hard to fix a carceral system that can be healing. I mean, in the state of North Carolina where I live, we have 3 public mental health hospitals for the whole state. And, to get into those places requires months, if not years in some cases. So if we don't have the capacity or access to reasonably treat people who are suffering from mental illness, the system is just going to get worse. It's not going to get better until we can create more access. As you experienced, the women that you lived with for those years, those women needed treatment that started in the womb for them. People needed opportunities to be liberated from their trauma. Of course, these women are going to end up in prison one day. We see a lot of these patients who are embroiled in substance use disorder, which is a mental illness, and how those patients are being pushed to prison, not to hospitals. That's a very curable disease. We have medication for that. We can treat with medication assistance therapy with Suboxone.
Where are there good models potentially that we could look to? Is anyone in the world getting this remotely right?
Yeah, this hospital in Norway.
It's always Norway. They always have it all figured out. Continue, sorry.
I mean, why is that? We have to ask, why is Norway getting it right? Their hardest criminals are sharing dormitory rooms and kitchens with each other and knives and learning how to continue living in community. And they get out of prison decades before the similar incarcerated person would in our country. And their recidivism rates are half of what ours are. So they go back to prison 50% less often. I mean, it's a no-brainer question. They're getting it right because people have access to primary care. They treat mental illness as a disease, not as a pathos, not as a crime. We treat mental illness as a crime in this country.
There are some examples here, though, of people taking mental illness more seriously inside the criminal justice system and diverting certain people to appropriate hospitals or long-term care facilities.
Probably the best example, I think, is a guy named Steve Leifman, who's a judge out of Miami, who has created a facility next to their jail, and he's diverting as many of these people as possible there. And he's decreased their daily budget by $636,000 per day that he's saving by simply diverting them to another facility where they can get therapy, where they can get life counseling, where they can have their tattoos removed, where they can, go to find a job. He really believes that you can change your mind, that a criminal mind is not a criminal mind forever. It was a criminal mind in that very brief moment where it was experiencing maybe its greatest fallibility in its life.
So much of the policy flows downstream from these base beliefs. Are criminals irredeemable? Is their behavior unalterable? Or can people change and grow and heal? That's the base belief that shapes the criminal justice system in places like Norway.
They've designed their prisons to rehabilitate, and they do it well. And it's not a difficult or complicated equation. You provide people with purpose. You provide people with a place. You provide people with a sense of dignity and community, and they get better. Those are the fundamentals that enable people to get better. In this one particular prison in Norway, they keep people tied to the community, and they don't strip their dignity away completely. They allow them the space to grow and to hope. Like, as you experienced, most of those women, I'm sure yourself, like you must have felt so hopeless. Once you experience that, and once you move into that mental space of learned helplessness, then that's when mental illness accelerates. I can't imagine what your mind was doing during that time, like, and how it must have devolved. Because as most people who go to prison, their mental illness doesn't get better. Like, it gets worse. Like,
oh no, it's bad. I saw a lot of people getting worse, and that really scared me. I saw it around me everywhere, and I was terrified of it, because it's not like I was somehow special or immune because I happened to be an innocent person. If anything, that gave me all the more reason to go crazy even faster. So I absolutely struggled seeing that around me all the time, and tried lots of different ways to maintain my sanity. And my family played a huge role in that. Like, they helped me stay connected, stay grounded in something that wasn't just a tortured environment. But yeah, it was really hard. And I had a lot of bad days. And I had a lot of learned helplessness that I had to unravel. Because when you're in a situation where you feel like nothing you do matters, and there's nothing you can do to help yourself or help anyone, it's a mind fuck.
Yet you were able to discover some forgiveness in that process too.
Oh, yeah. In a similar sort of interesting way, it occurred to me that just like all these other women who were around me who had committed harms and harmed people, it struck me that, like, the people who were harming me were no different. That they were also carrying something inside of them that made them think like they were justified in doing whatever it is that they were doing. And I think, like, being a victim of the criminal justice system puts someone in this very unique position of appreciating that, like, harm is not just being committed by the criminals. It's being committed by people who believe they are the good guys, and who posture as the good guys, and who wield power that we provide to them because we trust them to be the good guys. And what is going on in their brain if that's happening? It's something more complicated than they're just bad people or they're just good people. That became very abundantly clear to me. And then it opened up that question of curiosity. I think I'm lucky that I, too, tend to be a curious person. Instead of sort of being flummoxed or overwhelmed or discouraged by that realization, I instead got very, very curious. And I sort of have pursued that line of thought to a place of healing, ultimately, for myself.
You know, in order to solve this problem, it's going to take so many different people. And so it sounds like you've had the experience too of, like, really doing a deep dive and envisioning about how we can make impact. And so the space that I'm in right now is trying to revision and imagine how a single person could spread this word differently as a medical professional. And I'm really curious how you are trying to do that in your space, and how we can find a greater interconnectedness to make these concepts more prominent to people. That we're on a spectrum of free will, for sure. That healing is still possible. That change is even possible, because I think a lot of people in our system are feeling overwhelmed or discovered their own learned helplessness because the system is so big and complicated that they feel like it's impossible to change. But I'm realizing now that we can, and that our voices, if tied together, can do something much greater. And so that's sort of the space where I am in terms of trying to connect people together and kind of leverage what we're all doing in terms of this space.
I feel like building bridges so that the collective effort is more than the sum of its parts. is the only thing we can really do. But I think you're right that collective effort is necessary. My big takeaway from this conversation is this idea of law enforcement having a Hippocratic oath. Just this whole notion of do no harm. What a novel idea that maybe law enforcement and prosecution should have an idea in mind of doing no harm. Wow, what a new and novel but totally simple and obvious concept. And I love that I have been able to have that through our conversation. And now we both can sort of take that away and talk to other people. So let's do that.
Simple concepts. Yeah. Common sense and common heart. I think still the concept that drives me the most is the reverence for life part. Because the further we get away from an organized society where we function well and respect one another is kind of owning up to that. We have a responsibility to protect those people who are the most vulnerable. And we know who those people are. They're in our prisons right now, and they cost a lot of money to be there. Thank you for bringing that concept of Hippocratic oath. I'm going to definitely use that one.
Yeah. Get out there.
Just recently, Dr. Gilmer's efforts advocating on behalf of Vince Gilmer finally paid off. Though Vince Gilmer had been granted a conditional pardon by Virginia Governor Ralph Northam in 2022, his release was dependent on finding a secure medical facility that would take him. So he sat in prison as a pardoned man for 2.5 years as his Huntington's disease progressed. But finally, a hospital in North Carolina agreed to care for Vince Gilmer. And so on May 23, 2024, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer drove down to accompany Vince, along with his mother, to the hospital. Vince Gilmer can no longer walk and has trouble communicating, but he's no longer in prison, and he's now receiving actual medical care. Dr. Benjamin Gilmer told the press that Vince Gilmer has had more interventions today than he had probably had cumulatively in more than a decade. Now we're going to see what happens when you actually treat somebody.
You can find Dr. Benjamin Gilmer at benjamingilmer.com, where you'll also find more information about his book, The Other Dr. Gilmer. Thanks for getting lost with us. Find us on Twitter, at Amanda Knox.
At ManUnderBridge.
You can learn more about our work and how to support it at knoxrobinson.com. And we hope your genes and environment and the stimulus of our podcast have inclined you to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.
Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. This episode was written and produced by us. Our managing producer is Andre Sapp, our assistant producer is Jasper Merrill, and our theme music is by Josh Budo Karp.
Fun fact, for every hour of Labyrinths you enjoy, we put in dozens of hours researching, outreaching, interviewing, scripting, editing, and audio engineering.
What keeps us going?
Coffee. So if you're enjoying Labyrinths, please buy us a coffee.
Head over to patreon.com/Knox Robinson, where you can make a monthly donation.
Thanks for getting lost with us.